One of the, I guess, designs of stuck energy is that when pain gets to be too big for the ego to face in its current state of development and maturity, that it turns away from the issue. And in turning away, the issue goes unresolved and the pain goes unanswered. And in the unanswered large volume of pain comes the phenomena of pain management, which in the short term alleviates pain, but in the long term, all anesthetics lead to more pain because in the numbing, they lead to more violation. If, for example, we anesthetize an arm and can no longer feel it, or when our teeth have been, or our mouth has been anesthetized in dental surgery, it's common to bite the mouth because without pain, we don't get the cue that says, this is not a good idea. This is violating some boundary, some part of the body. As an empath born into a family in which the primary rule was the absence of deep feelings, meaning when both parents have traumatic wounds that they feel incapable of dealing with, the child waking up in that environment, blending to a certain extent with the emotional state of both parents, the child is exposed to the anesthetized wound, but is also exposed to the control mechanism, thou shalt not feel, because if you feel, you induce feelings in your parents, and if their primary survival strategy is not to feel something they don't know how to deal with, you become the enemy as the child, the one who returns the parent to the unhealed wound. It's very difficult in such a small, dependent state to transcend the fears and faulty beliefs of the giants around you, because when their consistent behavior communicates, it's too dangerous to feel. What you're doing, who you're being, is terrifying to me. I, as the giant, cannot deal with you. It's very natural to internalize this and say, there must be something wrong with me that is making God and Goddess, these figureheads of masculine and feminine energy, terrified. And if they're punishing me for having these feelings, then there must be something bad about my feelings, something bad about the parts in me that evoke these feelings. And part of the lifting out of this stuck place is alleviating the suffering
and now that you're in a comfortable position,
in some way,
let yourself relax,
which is difficult to find in our culture.
just let
And
yourself begin the process.
I'm playing the audible hypnosis pattern in the background because healthy grieving process, grief, help, and peace
Your mind and body.
is the way that I got through this stuck place this evening, and in doing so was able to see. And because that's a living process, and because many things can go on in parallel, I'm keeping the program playing as a soothing for myself and perhaps for you, in the understanding that it's very difficult to look at traumatic grief directly and alone. And so
Or make an audible sound.
the duality of these two audio tracks in the background, certainly that I can hear, and to some extent in the that you can hear as well,
Concentrate on your breath.
divides attention enough to perhaps look at things that in our culture are overwhelming, at least for me and perhaps for some of you as well. And so I've created in the cessation, in the period of interrupted heaviness, a little bit of a map that's been, it's been a long time coming, this map, because in order to see clearly, one has to feel. And my third grade teacher, a woman who I bonded to much more than my mother because my mother was incapable of feeling and forming an emotional connection with herself or anyone else. And my father was capable of feeling, but did a great deal to ensure that anyone that made him feel was punished. And so most of his feelings were that of pain and conflict and suffering until his death. And so in the same way that we need some kind of an alleviation to look through, I've turned to massage, I've turned to various healing forms, just to bring the pain level down to perhaps 60%, so that I don't feel flooded, and immediately engulfed with the terrain as I go into it. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross has talked about the stages of grief. And I want to postulate that the biggest grief that we deal with in this culture is separation from the wholeness of our own psyche, the wholeness of our own self. And pain is separation from and longing for mastery, authenticity, symmetry, grace, all of the parts of ourselves that are asked to move to the side, both those that are judged as too dark to look at and those that are judged as too light to acknowledge. These parts of the self are pushed into the wings through our cult taboos. Pain equals separation from and longing for. And when the parts of us that have been lost before language, one of the things that we need to turn our conscious mind back into the terrain of those things that have been separated is language. We need language, and we need a paradigm that allows for the existence of that which we long for in ourself, which is, of course, the first step in finding that which we long for in the world around us, in the cultural memes that express and reflect the truncated identity that we've become. The need for language and the need for paradigm equals the need for truth. The need for truth equals the need for beauty, because the deeper one sees into a paradigm of truth, the more symmetrical, the more complete that which is viewed, that which is seen becomes. Because we are by our nature, reality is by nature symmetrical, and in its symmetry graceful, and in its complexity and in its synergy beautiful and successful. If you can think of a sphere or a wheel being cut down into a square, it becomes a very bumpy ride, as all patterns of energy must move forward in order to live. All life is simply a flowing of one kind or another, a breath of one kind or another, a cycle of one kind of another, a movement. Life is that which moves. Death is that which stagnates, which is stuck, which is rigid and ossified. And so we move forward with our square wheels, with our square identity. And it is a violent ride, going up on the tip of the square, crashing down onto the flat part, feeling stuck, building up the energy. Each step forward in an asymmetrical paradigm is a bumpy ride. And this is our fall from grace, the fall from the complexity of the larger symmetry of reality into the truncated version of egoic consciousness that our cult is willing to sanction. Need for beauty equals the need for synergy and symmetry, which is the need for belonging, which is the need for interconnectedness. When we look through tunnel vision, through the frame of our square, we see individual objects, but not in context with their ecological framework. And I've talked a lot about that in the most mundane sense, the way that we experience this is my shirt, this is my necklace, these are my ornaments, this is my nose. But of course, if we step back even a few moments with objectivity, we understand that we didn't come up with the color blue. We didn't invent the loom. We did not single-handedly invent the world shipping network. We didn't invent the ocean. We didn't invent the parents who gave birth to this body. The object is interconnected with every other object within this framework of reality. We're just asked to ignore that, to tune out the ecological awareness that blocks our sense of wholeness, that blocks our sense of belonging, that in a bit of faulty accounting pretends that the profit came out of nowhere as opposed to these expenses relating to all these millions of people and these incomes relating to all these income of millions of people. Because our income didn't just come out of nowhere. It ripples. It ripples out into the larger global economy, much like our finger or a ring didn't just come into being in this moment. It ripples back into the past and ripples into the future as no energy is created or destroyed. It only changes form from one to another, and in the changing of form dances in a way with everything else. The farthest star shares the same gravitational constant as a finger. And if the law of gravity changes, it changes not only for our finger, but for every star in the multiverse. We are so connected, and we see with so much limitation. Interconnectedness and a complex paradigm of viewing leads naturally to the optimal states of synergy, where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, something that we see happening all around us, where the whole of our planetary ecology is so much bigger than our individual ecology. And synergy leads to success. Synergy leads to abundance. And abundance and success leads to the safety, leads to the competency out of which gratitude, out of which love is born. When we are in a reality that is competent, that is successful, we are in a reality in which we feel safe and abundant. When we are feeling safe and abundant, and we see the living connection that supports our being between us and the objects and structures around us, we naturally feel love. There's no need for affirmation. It emerges. It emerges as a synergy, as a reading from the scientific instrument of the human heart that says, yes, this is the direction to move in. And this is a story of my grief and journey of acceptance. Grief at the separation from the self that I long to be, and separation from that self which I long to be, and the pain that feels too big to bridge between the gap between who I want to be and who I am. As that pain grows with the separation from that self, there is grief, there is sadness that marks the terrain, that communicates in the language of the instrument of the heart that we're going farther away from grace. I want to talk a little bit about the mathematics of forgiveness, because just like grief was not a technology taught to me as a child, and when my third grade teacher died, the woman I had the strongest emotional bond with, I went numb because my feelings were threatening to my parents, and dissociated from a very large part of my emotional self that was identified as fearful, as frightening and taboo, because my parents were frightened of it, because my culture didn't know how to deal with that. And all energy is not, there's no pocket of reality for energy placed somewhere to just disappear. Pressure and emotional charge, when it is elicited by a series of circumstances, doesn't just disappear because we've pushed it under. It finds circuitous routes to express itself, in my case becoming hyperactive, not only emotionally numb, but hyperactive, so that my body could try and move the anxiety, the terror, the feelings through. And in becoming hyperactive in an education system that didn't know how to deal with grief and did not know how to deal with traumatic symptoms, I became scapegoated again. So the first grief expression was the first scapegoating, where the child is feared by the parent. And the second wave of traumatic symptoms, partitioning that emotion aside, again in a framework where the giants, where the grown-ups do not know how to deal with traumatic symptoms, to recognize them or respond, again a scapegoating, where I was expelled from Waldorf school, creating great shame for my father, who at some level understood his own inadequacy to raise a child capable of engaging even in the systems of his ideal philosophies, his Waldorf and anthroposophical interests and beliefs, creating shame in my father and moving the family, as he rejected and felt small and withdrew from that system and actually moved the whole family over to England. But in a paradigm where the problem was placed on me, the child, where I was the one who didn't know how to deal with my feelings, as opposed to the culture being the one who did not know how to treat or raise parents or treat or raise children. It's very confusing when the circle of grown-ups around a child doesn't know how to deal with what is being invoked, the readings, so to speak, on the thermometer of the human heart that basically communicates here's what's going on inside the psyche, and what's going on inside the psyche is interconnected with what's going on in the outer environment. Meaning if the Waldorf teacher with whom I had a strong bond had another way of processing the energies without a violent death, then I don't lose the primary person to whom I can have. She was the one person not afraid of her own feelings or mine. And so she was the one with whom I could grow and develop. Now, the issue of banishment, the issue of taboo, is always an individual one in the sense that at a deep level, we understand that we're a part of the system. We understand that if we are in a system in which there is abuse, in which there is violation, in which there is fear, in which there is shame, that it has something to do with us, that there are no witnesses in our paradigm of reality. There are only participants, those that cause and those that allow. And there was a 6-year-old, 7-year-old, 8-year-old, 9-year-old child. There's very little within a legal and financial framework that I could cause. There's nonetheless a helpless allowing, an unfolding of a cultural pattern within my body that is taking me further and further away from the person that feels blessed, that feels lovable, that feels acceptable. And with that withdrawal, as that gap is widened, here's the lovable child and you're way over here. There is, of course, a bitterness. The heart reads an environment that allows this to occur within any human being as being incompetent, unsafe, unloving in the paradigm of love and competency. When you love enough, you care. When you care enough, you see. When you see with patience, you understand. When you understand with love, you empathize. When you empathize and understand, you attune. When you attune with a feedback dialogue, you learn. When you learn, you become competent. Competent at engaging. When you become competent, you succeed. And when you succeed at creating a world that welcomes data, the data of the psyche, that welcomes the personas elicited by the environment, that welcomes the mathematical total as well as explores the mathematical equation. You see, we have companies that like to run businesses in a certain way, but they don't like the bottom line, and so they distort the figures. And in doing so, are saying this total is unacceptable. I don't accept this total because the financial institutions around me, the stock analysts, do not accept this total as a total worth investing in. And so if the total is viewed as inadequate, there is a tremendous push towards corruption, corrupting the numbers so that another total can be brought out. And the same, of course, happens in a psyche when a child learns that this child is lovable because they have a different total. The expression of the self in the moment is the total of that equation of the different beliefs and patterns and cultures and ecological influences going on in that child. What's happening in the present moment is the total that is produced. When that total is viewed as shameful and taboo, the child seeks to create an adaptive persona. an adaptive personality that masks the total, that is a pretense. And in doing so, of course, buries the total, the reality of the psyche, deeper and deeper, viewing it as what is bad, what is unlovable and evil, not because it is unlovable, not because the total is bad. A scientific instrument, be it the human heart or a calculator, is designed to reveal the equations that lead up to that total. They're not designed to fudge the number. Calculators tell the truth. You have to willfully put in different numbers. You have to pretend, no, we lost lots of money in this last quarter because we paid $3 for socks and we sold them for $2, and we sold 1 million socks, so we have $1 million loss, plus overhead 1.5 million, but that's not acceptable. But rather than learn from the equation, we represent and we say, no, we only paid 50 cents for the socks, and suddenly it looks like we're profitable. And in a culture of incompetence, the truth is not welcome. The mathematical framework that reveals the true feelings, the true responses, the true behaviors that would come out of that are taboo. And so there's a whitewashing to put on a new total, and it becomes who can create the people who win within an incompetent culture are the people that present these incomplete totals. And there's a deep violation with the psyche that wants to return to truth and that understands that pain is a teacher. That if we can look pain in the face and say this plus this plus this plus this plus this equals separation from and longing for the feelings we want to have, the people we want to be, the reality we want to create. If we can look pain in the face and analyze the numbers that produced it, we can turn course. But if we don't know how to turn course, and we can't face a sociopathic cult that is committed to condemning the accurate totals that this pattern of behavior is producing, sometimes we descend into shame and carry the culture shadow of that which is unlovable, which is truly that which this cult is unable to love. This cult didn't produce parents capable of loving an emotional boy. It didn't produce parents capable of loving my 4 younger siblings. That creates traumatic dissociation. This culture didn't produce a Waldorf school with grown-ups capable of recognizing traumatic symptoms, nor did it produce adults capable of admitting their own inadequacy, nor did it produce adults who knew where to look within the language and the paradigm of the cults to learn about trauma. Trauma being a dirty secret in a culture that has its beginnings in the violation and the trauma of whole races, of whole peoples, breaking its own laws multiple times, refracted down to the parental level with the parent, again, breaking their own laws, the stated ideal, the actual behavior, the stated laws, the underhanded violation. And when that creates dissonance in the psyche of the child, this cult didn't produce teachers capable of owning their own mistake. And so the child is rejected for failing to adequately present a false persona, to put on a pretense that everything's fine, because that's what every incompetent leader desperately wants to hear. How's everyone doing? So-and-so has a corn on their foot, so-and-so is weak, so-and-so is dehydrated, but we don't have the logistical infrastructure to respond to those needs, and so The ego gratification is looking for, we're fine, everything's fine. And those are the people willing to lie about the underlying consequence of the reality that get invited back to the party. It's fine, I feel great. Everything's fine. Well, what's fine exactly? And what do you mean by fine? Oh, I don't want to go into it. Don't look too deeply, because there's a fear. There's a fear in our culture that if we reveal the incompetence of a lover to satisfy us, that rather than learn to satisfy us, they will reject us and go find someone else who lies and says they're a great lover. And we don't want to be abandoned, and so we cover it up. Forgiveness begins with self-forgiveness, which begins with self-acceptance. It is incredibly terrifying for a young ego to accept the parts of themselves that every grown-up around them is afraid of. And what every grown-up around them is afraid of is the data. And what they're afraid the data will reveal is that they don't know what they're doing. And what they're afraid that might point to is a need for change. But when there's an incompetence, when there's a sense of fear of the unknown, which every traumatic culture produces in high doses, fear of the unknown, because all trauma enters the psyche and enters the world with shock, which means it enters with surprise, which means it wasn't seen coming and it wasn't prepared for, which by definition means that the box-like structure that we were using to navigate through reality wasn't wide enough to anticipate the reverberations of our own actions in the mirror-like nature of reality. So we didn't see that when we didn't do this and didn't do this and didn't do this and didn't do this and didn't do this, that sets our car up for an accident. That when we didn't attend to this thought and this thought and this belief and that belief, it put our mind in an incompetent state to drive, which when we then drive an incompetent vehicle in an incompetent state, it dramatically increases the probability of an accident, which seems to come out of nowhere only because we're not making the connection. And we can't afford in many ways to make the connection because, like a child, the most terrifying thing to realize is that your parents don't know what they're doing, and they have total control of your life. This is an overwhelmingly petrifying. It induces the kind of trauma that is freezing, which blocks development, and so the child owns the dynamic as it's their fault, because that's an easier thing to deal with. It's an easier thing for a child to say, I'm bad, but one day I might learn to be good if I do everything that pleases the grown-ups around me, than it is for the child to say, I've got a bunch of fucked up giants in control of my life, and I've got very low odds of coming out of here healthy and sane. And there's not much that I can do about it because everything I try and bring up about that frightens them so much that they attack, that they go into the trauma in their fear of the unknown. But whereas a child might freeze, a parent fights in the fight, flight, freeze paradigm because they've got mass, because they can win. They don't need to run. They can beat. They can shame. They can shout. And it overloads the child's system. And they understand they can't win. They're in a relationship of scale with 5 to 10 odds against them, in a relationship where they need the parent to survive, to feel secure, to feel love and belonging, to have self-esteem, to develop their gifts, to have any chance of graduating that particular school of reality from infancy into adulthood. Forgiveness begins with self-forgiveness because there is an innate awareness of participation in reality, whether by causing or by allowing there are no observers in any field of reality. If we're there witnessing something, it has something to do with us. And in the absence of cultural programming and teaching that would explain what it does have to do with us, that maybe there's a luminous answer, maybe we are the teachers that bring light to a dysfunctional system, maybe that's what it has to do with us. That's not an answer that the giants around us want to allow, and they have the mass, but they're happy to allow and foist the idea that the thing that it has to do with us is that we are fundamentally bad and unlovable, and that any time we express these parts of our personality, that we are the unlovable part, that it's not their inability to love that is the issue, it is the fact that something is fundamentally unlovable. How can a child accept something that nothing around them can accept is the crisis. And so they don't. They internalize the abuse system, side with the abuser, and reject and start fearing the larger portion of their own psyche that is their friend, but is not the friend of a corrupt power structure, that is not the friend of a corrupt culture, of an immature culture. In order to have self-acceptance, which is the first step of being able to forgive oneself, one must have understanding. One must be able to create a narrative that has a total that is something other than that you are fundamentally bad and unlovable. This is a total, certainly implied by the cultural structure around us, but that is untenable because we have integrity. If we truly believe we have no value, that we are fundamentally flawed and are fundamentally unlovable, and that those are the authentic parts of ourselves, that only the adaptive personality is accepted. And I remember developing an adaptive personality in which I tested every pattern of behavior and found the pattern of behavior that made my parents comfortable. And it was a conformist, naughty boy, I would say, is the thing. They were very comfortable with the idea that I was a dysfunctional, naughty boy who had developmental disorders. This took all the attention away from them, and they could commiserate with other parents who all understood, and so they could accept themselves as parents of a naughty boy. They couldn't accept themselves as traumatic violators who didn't know what they were doing. And so if I would agree to be a naughty boy and manage to meet my needs in some way or other along those lines, I was acceptable. And even there was a sense of gratitude and relief that I was willing to be what they needed me to be to love themselves. In the pain, in the trauma, in the fear of living in the scarcity of our culture, to become the enemy of giants is itself a traumatic undertaking. And so there's a real sense of bottling up authenticity in order to navigate the world through personas that other people can accept themselves around and thus not attack. There's a need for understanding, because when any individual can understand that equation, they can have enormous empathy for that child, if they're an adult. If they're not an adult, of course, they're in the child dynamic of hating the parts that other people don't know how to love. The need for understanding leads to the need for self-love, and with true understanding comes self-love. With self-love comes the ability to transcend the wound, to transcend the bottleneck of dysfunctional, poorly routed energy. And there's nothing wrong with the energy itself. What happens is if you're bringing live energy, and all energy has a positive and negative potential, a destructive and constructive attention. You can think of electricity. If you have a poor paradigm for bringing electricity into the world, you're going to create shorts and all kinds of fires and stuff and shocks and electrocution, because it's there as a neutral energy, but you're pitting it against each other, creating little fires here, violations here, etc. But you don't know what you're doing. You don't know what you're doing, and so it's creating violation, it's creating pain. Because the paradigm that is being used to organize it is incomplete, inconsistent, the problem of every cult. Every cult defines itself within a narrow band of the probability field that is the psyche, and then seeks to defend against the traumatic unknown by identifying with those boundaries as a part, instead of identifying with the larger ecology that is always more complex than the conscious mind can fully grasp, because there's a state of mystery. When you are a traumatized and terrified cult, you cannot tolerate mystery, so you cannot tolerate the unknown. And so you have to limit the view of reality to such a point where it is known. You cannot transcend the wound with the same level of intelligence that creates the wound. You have to go outside the box, which means reaching a level of maturity as an individual that one is able to see interconnected and larger patterns of reality that are much bigger than your cult or your parental system is comfortable dealing with. And this means going it alone. Going it alone is a terrifying prospect for the parts that are still loyal to the cult. For the parts in us that are surviving and feeling secure in our survival and feeling some sense of limited love and belonging, by pretending that these parts of us don't exist. And if they do, we're all agreeing that I should be ashamed of them and they're bad. That's how the infant survived. And so as we, in the path to maturity, start reclaiming the parts of ourselves that are outside of our cult's paradigm, we face death. We face the screams of a traumatized infant and adolescent that says, don't go there. We tried going there and it nearly killed us. Our parents hated us. The world will hate us. We're one person. The world is a very big place. Don't go there. Don't open up. And yet the myopia of the cult framework is responsible for creating the failure, the trauma, the pain to begin with. Without going there, there is no possibility of transcending the wound. And one of the big frictions within every psyche in our culture is the part of us that wants to wake up, the part of us that wants to get bigger than our cult, and the part of us that says, don't do it, it's not safe, you don't know what you're doing, we've been there, you'll die. And the part of us that wants to become more can hate, not learning any model for loving that child. The template for relating to that child and adolescent is one of hate and fear. As we hate and fear the child, as it seeks to sabotage the transcendence process that threatened its survival, as we seek to transcend the child by hating the child and adolescent, they become more and more certain that we don't know what we're doing, because we don't. Because we haven't learned to be an adult any more than the parents around us. Because the definition of an adult is that which protects, loves, welcomes data, and responds. The definition of an adult is responsibility, the ability and willingness to respond, to reduce pain, to create healing and create love. Now, how does an individual learn that in a cult that is founded on suppression and shame? And so there can be a self-hatred of that part that wants to grow up also, that I don't know what I'm doing, that I don't know how to transcend this wound. I just know how to reenact the wound of my parents on myself. As I split myself between the spiritual and the cult, as I turn the cult into the enemy because I don't know how to transcend it. We need self-love, which leads to transcendence of the wound. When we can transcend the wound by stepping outside of the box that created it, we have a sense of freedom. We are reconnecting with something bigger that is capable of healing it. As Einstein said, you cannot solve a problem or heal a wound with the same level of technology, with the same level of consciousness that created it. Because if you had sophisticated consciousness in your cult, the wound wouldn't be there in the first place. So the answer is not in the cult. It's in something bigger. But when everything that first greets us in the unknown are the banished parts of the psyche we have come to believe are bad, we become faced with the view of ourselves as bad as we try and transcend the cult. And when we look around us for reassurance, we're met instead by people turning away who haven't dealt with that terrain in themselves. So it is in our cult, on the outside, a very lonely and a very painful journey. Transcending the wound allows us to let go of the other. Because in forgiveness, when something is unforgiven, it's bound up. We're saying, I don't accept this part of myself. I don't like and I don't accept. And I don't want the part of me that created this. I don't want the part of me that participated. I want nothing to do with that. I hate the part of me that let me be raped. I hate the part of me that didn't know what to do as a 6-year-old child. And the amount of hatred as we go through this process, and I've helped my partner in this as well, the amount of hatred that is directed at the young ones for not being bigger than the big ones is immense. And one cannot transcend the wound without welcoming them in, without a template for doing so in the cult around us. The template, as we feel fear, we look to the familiar. As we look to the familiar, we look to our cult. As we hang to our cult, we reenact the abuse. When we let go of the unforgiven self by forgiving and loving that self, this is the point where we are free of the other. Because within the child and adolescent paradigm, they are in a codependent relationship where they need the abuser to change before they can change. Because they don't have the mass, and they don't have the freedoms, and they don't have the law, and they don't have the money, and they don't have the life skills to transcend it on their own. If they can't get their parent to be fair, to tell the truth, then they live in an unfair lie. Because that's what's shaped by the massive power structure around them, supported by the fictitious version of the Old Testament God, read by my father at different times to, instill the fear of God. A God that will split children in half as a test to see who gets into his gang. A child that will lead his people around, in the wilderness for 40 years for who knows what reason. A terrifying, cruel, and sadistic projection of the sociopathic parent. We finally can let go of the other, which then leads to forgiving the other. When we transcend the wound, it's a process of maturing. Only then can we forgive the other, and only then, when we are free of the wound, can we have empathy for those in the system that are still caught in the wound. empathy and sadness, an understanding of what they're dealing with, and the understanding that it's not personal. It's not personal. My father didn't ask to be born into a sociopathic family with a father that had PTSD from World War II, with an alcoholic psychologist who could create incisive insight with sociopathic cruelty. My father was hit as he got close to his parents. He abused me less, but not enough to mitigate the helplessness, the hatred, the fear and the anger that I felt in this bind. This is the path of forgiveness. And when one is in trauma, it is impossible to forgive oneself. When it is impossible to forgive oneself, one cannot forgive the other. And so there is clinging in hatred, which creates a certain connection with the abuser, which doesn't end well, because if the abuser was capable of doing anything other than abuse, they would have done so, and they haven't. And so it keeps this dynamic. And so the first step that I ran into was being stuck at every step of this process. Next comes the helplessness, as the reenactment of the traumatized grown-up has regressed into the child and adolescent. So we have helplessness, need for language. I need someone to put this thing into words. But I'm in a cult that doesn't want to put things into words because it doesn't want to see, because it doesn't want to deal with reality. The need for language, the need for a culture of support that would help me as a regressed child go through this. The need for that in a regressed state to come out of that, which then led to failure because that support wasn't there in the cult. Failure on my part equals pain. Pain without the capacity to respond equals self-blame. But I'm sophisticated enough as a well-read human being. I'm sophisticated to know that there's something wrong, that there's something off and incomplete about the parental culture, about the education culture, about the therapeutic culture, which I've been a part of, and I don't feel able to change alone. And so the self-blame, of course, gets projected out. I blame you, Peter Sandhill, for insisting on an overdose. I blame you, Ann Watts, for telling me to keep it secret and that this was for my benefit against all the data. As I'm reading the data frantically to see what should be happening here, this is all wrong. My therapists are in collusion with an abuse shame cult designed to protect themselves from facing their own incompetency publicly, rather than focusing on helping me out. And I don't know how to do it on my own. So I blame and I hate you. Hurt plus helplessness plus betrayal in a regressed state always equals hate. If you want to understand why you feel hate, if you will go into the areas that you feel hate, and every one of us in our culture can touch those parts in childhood, etc., you will find a combination. And all you have to do to alleviate the hate is to provide adequate certainty and adequate support to the one who is hating. As soon as they get helped, they stop, it deletes the helplessness. And hate rarely exists without helplessness. And so you can alleviate the helplessness and thus the hate by helping. But you can't help when your primary agenda is secrecy and masking. It just doesn't work.
Just notice the relaxation beginning.
Blame equals alone and lonely, because I'm blaming myself to protect the new parent, the new therapeutic structure, the leaders of my cult and community. So I'm alone and lonely to protect something that's more important than my well-being to them.
And as you continue breathing comfortably,
Now, the fact that I'm talking about this at all, something that I felt I would die if I did as a child, and so I shut up, the fact that I'm talking about this at all leads me to be feared by any person who isn't able or ready to deal with this terrain.
you don't need to see all 20 steps at once.
The fear of the new power structure is again communicating there's something wrong with the part of me that's being feared,
Relax and just notice
that I'm the problem, which just adds to the blame and sense of self-blame and self-loneliness, which adds to the hate and the pain, which adds to the anger. We always feel angry when some part of our own healthy self is violated. And any time someone is saying that there is something fundamentally fearful about you, it's not that I'm scared of dealing with you. It's that you're scary. Anytime that gets transferred in a vertical relationship, in this case a professional relationship with therapists and clients, you create a sense of shame. And it's a violation. It's a violation of truth, for one thing. It's a violation of ethics, for another. It doesn't lead to well-being. And if every professional abuses their client, then we have no need for professionals. But we do have need for professionals. We have need for adult professionals who put their clients' needs first. But if they can't, then the only healthy response is to dissociate from professionals, which leaves us then back to dealing with things our own in a language structure that doesn't help us navigate or know how we got here, but which associates loneliness and aloneness with trauma. Because in a highly populated planet, we need other people for survival, security, love, and belonging. And if we understand that we will not get that survival, security, love, and belonging if we tell the truth that is necessary to see and thus transcend the wound, we're in a stuck place. And I've been in this stuck place for quite some time.
that staircase. And
The failure in terms of, the therapeutic failure in relationship with Peter Sandhill and the high facilitators, then got externalized as Peter Sandhill pushed next that I marry a woman that I was incompetent to love and who was incompetent to love me, pushing against the data as a relationship that included mutual trauma and violation escalated in order to satisfy my abuser with a psychic vision that said, in what he kept repeating was, your most luminous future, according to my psychic vision, is that you marry this woman who is violent, who is not telling the truth, who abandons your little boy, who embodies the abuse dynamic. It is impossible to connect healthily without having a map that puts language into this terrain, which I still didn't have. Because at this point, not a single therapist or parent or teacher had told me what trauma was, or that I had been induced repeatedly into states of post-traumatic stress. into dissociation. And so the spiritual critic is there because I've grown up in New Age circles that says this is bad. You should be feeling alive and loving, not numb and fearful. But I don't feel alive and loving. I feel numb and fearful. So the numb and fear is bad, because in any system where the protocol that produces an emotional state is sanctified, is unquestioned, but the results of interacting with the protocol are taboo, you have this phenomena where the environment is saying, here's 2 plus 2, but we want it to equal 7. But it doesn't, it equals 4. And they say, well, that's not good enough. We have a good system. You come up with 7. We'll give you 2 and 2, and you come up with 7. And if you talk about 4, there's something wrong with you. There's not something wrong with the fact that we're giving you 2, and we're giving you 2, and that doesn't equal 7. You're missing 3. If you add in the third bit, I'll be able to report back 7. I can't report that. I see a 4 in there. Failure with WIPA, failure in the high community, equals frustration, helplessness, pain, loneliness, bitterness, and a sense of unlovability, because I'm not able to create love. I'm not able to give and receive love in the way that is longed for. Separation from and longing for equals pain. Unanswered pain demands an anesthetic. Cynicism is an anesthetic. Blame is an anesthetic. Self-harm is a distraction. When you feel in pain in an area, you feel helpless if you'll just cut yourself, for example. The cutting distracts the pain from the area you feel helpless. Now you've got pain in an area that you are masterful. I feel pain when I cut myself. I'm in charge. And so it's a distraction. It's pulling the ego out of the domain in which it feels helpless and redirecting it to an area where it feels competent. I know how to cut myself. Emotionally, physically, etc. Blame, shame, etc. are emotional cuts, mental cuts. Physical cuts are a cruder way, which is why they're often used by children, including my wife and her abusive childhood, where, just completely incompetent sociopathic parents producing horrendous emotional states blamed on the child. What's she going to do? You've got to transcend helplessness because you're frozen in helplessness. And so if you can distract and focus on the pain where you have charge, then you have an illusion of control and you don't collapse as a psyche. And this is a large part of the traumatic world which people are incompetent to deal with. We don't look to the system that creates helplessness and pain when we see someone cutting, and we generally punish people for revealing that they are self-harming themselves, as opposed to asking what we're doing wrong as a system. The system is sanctified because it protects us from chaos. Control and the known is sanctified because it protects us from the unknown. Avoiding the unknown is the paramount value of a traumatized culture who fears the new wave of chaos and trauma coming in from the unknown, but of course the unknown is neutral. The beautiful unknown is what is stepped into through competence. The painful unknown is what, when we step into terrain in unconsciousness, we always violate part of ourselves and part of the larger reality of which we are a part. So none of this is addressed as I find myself pushed into a failure dynamic with Peter Sandhill's vision. And so it becomes harder to love myself. I'm again separate from who I want to be and how I want to be treated and where I am and how I'm being treated. This pain is now immense because it's not being dealt with within any of my outer relationships. And for those of you who haven't done a tremendous amount of therapy, I've worked with 40 or so practitioners and spent well over 150,000 just in one-on-one treatments, not counting all the workshops and things. You will probably notice, as I did, that every therapist has some area of competence, which if we translated it into a physical discipline, we might call gutter cleaning. So you discover that this healer is a good gutter cleaner. And this therapist knows how to wash windows. And this therapist knows how to vacuum. And this therapist knows how to air out the house. And this therapist knows how to listen with acceptance and provide a container. But none of them know how their discipline relates to other therapists and other healers. And so they all present it in similar language. I help people. And if you have fudgy windows from decades of caked up abuse in a culture that throws mud at those windows but doesn't clean them, and you go to a gutter cleaner, they will tell you what a great healer they are, and they will go in and clean the gutters. But there weren't many leaves in that gutter to begin with. That wasn't the issue, and there's a frustration. If you give that frustration back to the healer and say, I don't feel any better, their response is typically, well, I'm a good healer and it helped other people, meaning with this level of blindness, if that healer finds someone who has clogged gutters and they're a gutter cleaner, they will clean the gutters and there'll be this big breakthrough. And of course, every healer wants to love themselves and say that I'm a great healer. And the best way to do that is to succeed. And so if you see 100 patients and you're a gutter cleaner and there's 10 of them that have great breakthroughs because you cleaned their gutters, then you will be validated. Yes, I'm a great healer. Look, that person got healed, that person got healed. And that's what you want. And you don't quite understand, why is it that this person is worse after this? Well, maybe because they got their hopes up. You cleaned their gutters that didn't need cleaning, and then you said, how was I? How is it? And they say nothing. And they say, well, sometimes it takes a while. Try working with me for 6 months, and then we'll evaluate. And you get to the end of 6 months, and all that time the windows are dirty and it doesn't get sorted, and then and the healer is looking for validation. I want to know that I'm a good healer. And you'd love to be able to tell them they're a great healer. But they can clean gutters till the cows come home. They're not going to get the windows cleaned because they don't know. They don't have a complex enough model of the psyche to understand what they are and are not doing and where they fit into the whole system of the psyche. And so they could leave the person poorer, disappointed, and feeling they need to lie to make the therapist feel good because they revealed vulnerable things they can't love about themselves. Now, the worst thing that can happen if you reveal things that you don't know how to love in yourself, because no one has modeled loving those in your entire life, and in fact, multiple people have told you you're bad and unlovable for having these things, and you reveal these things, a therapist can really hurt you. Because you're in a state of kind of ambivalence, like maybe there's someone who can love this part. I can't. I'm not sure if it's lovable. I've been told it isn't by Mom. Every time I express this part, she's scared and withdraws. Every time I express this part to Dad, he hits me. Every time I express it to a lover, she says I'm unsexy. So it doesn't seem like it's very lovable because no one's loving it. But this healer says they're going to heal and love, so of course we want that. Can it be done? Well, the therapist can often love themselves if they're successful. They can say, I'm a great healer, and they can be magnanimous. But if they're a complete failure, because they don't know what they're doing in a terrific terrain, and the biggest area that came up was around trauma. In all 40 therapists, not a single person said the word trauma. Not a single person recommended a book on trauma. Not a single person explained the biology of trauma, and not a single person looked at dramatic traumatic symptoms and said, you are in trauma, and here's how we treat trauma, but I'm not good at that. Go see this person. Instead, they all they all pledged in the taking in that we're going to help. And they didn't help with trauma, which was the underlying key. That's the main thing you need help with. And I had this frustrating journey through life where I knew what was wrong. I knew what would work, but I would experience pain past my threshold of endurance as I tried to do what would work, because it would take me in the domain of trauma, which needs help. So I needed someone that grasped that I was in trauma and knew what to do about it and helped me effectively. But I didn't find that individual. And after a while, because, when you begin, like when I did acupuncture, the acupuncture triggered a release of some of the traumatic repression. But the acupuncturist didn't teach me about trauma or the biology or what the paradigm was. She just said, lay down for 20 minutes, and I felt dissociative for 3 days after that session. And I called her and I said, why do I feel so terrible after paying you to be healed? And she said, oh, that happens sometimes. Don't worry, just come back and have another session. I said, do you mean to say that every time I pay you $100, I'm going to feel terrible for 3 days and that's supposed to happen? And she was busy and uncomfortable, so she didn't want to deal with that. And this is kind of the anger that starts to build up, that none of you will own that you don't know what you're doing. But you'll take money to not help and leave me feeling inadequate, that there's something deeply wrong with me because I'm not getting better. And everyone is there saying, I've got my shingle out, come and see me, I want to help. And I've never received a refund from a therapist in the way that, for example, in my profession as a garden installer, if I put a rose in a dark shadow of the house with no compost and no irrigation, and I tell the client, yeah, I know you like roses. You like roses? Here, let's have some roses. And I put a bunch of roses there and they all die. I could just say, that's interesting. Sometimes that happens. I put in roses in this other garden that happened to be well amended and out in the sun, and they did fine. But you must, maybe you have bad karma. It's like your roses aren't doing very well, but I put them in. I did my part, and so I'm off the hook. Of course I don't do that. And in a materialistic culture, we would, of course, investigate. The client would look on Google and say, of course they died. You charged me thousands of dollars to put the wrong plant in the wrong place and didn't irrigate them and didn't tell me how to maintain them. And now I've spent thousands of dollars, disappointment, frustration. I want my money back, and I want shade plants put there and da-da-da. Well, we would, of course, say that an ethical gardener would do that, but with healers, we don't yet have the competency to and there is no Wikipedia of how someone presenting this symptom or that symptom should be dealt with. And there's complete chaos in the healing fields, etc., where I would notice this, because I would often see 3 healers a week at a cost of $600. And I would notice that the one healer would talk about this and ignore what the other healer said, and the other healer would talk about this and ignore what the other healer said, and the other healer would talk about this and ignore what the other said. And it was left to me, well, what do I do with 3 different narratives, none of which deal with trauma? And the answer was always the same: come back and pay us some more money. Well, after 40 healers and stuff like this, what's wrong with me becomes the shame given The incompetence that is not owned is inadvertently always given to the client, the child, the patient, etc., because we in our culture, we elevate the professional. We elevate the healer. We elevate the teacher, the parent. They're never wrong. It's why you'll never get an apology out of a president of the United States. They may be just as incompetent as the rest of us and cause any amount of damage, but you'll never have a president say, look, I'm sorry that I damaged the economy. I'm sorry that I passed this bill that lost you your medical care. I'm sorry that your daughter died because I let in a rider from a big campaign donor that said that we would make safety less of an issue so they could save money on a $1 billion construction project. I'm very, very sorry for killing and damaging and harming and betraying all of you. And I'm sorry that we violated this country and bombed this wedding and did this. You won't find that in this cult, because that would be kind, because that would be authentic, because then we would have to start looking, if we can't elect a president who knows what they're doing, why would we expect us to be able to elect a teacher that knows what they're doing, or a parent? If we can't produce parents that know what they're doing, why would we be able to create a president? It's too scary, because it suggests the dissolution and transformation of a system that we don't have the competence to redesign better, and we're afraid of the unknown. And so this is taboo in an incompetent system. And so it ripples down to the healer. And in Western medicine, it's a little better. You'll have lots of, in policing, of course, they back each other up and say, well, of course we have to shoot unarmed black people. You have no idea what we're dealing with, and they don't go to jail and all that. But in Western medicine, if a doctor is caught administering anthrax into a patient, he is suspended and all of that, because we understand those systems well. But if an acupuncture is injecting traumatic symptoms without helping the client grasp the beliefs and the underlying cultural issues that have led to that repression in the first place, we just say, well, that's what I do. I put needles in people. If you don't want needles put in, don't come to me. And it's like, well, how do you know? I'm just wanting to feel better. But this shame, having spent up to 6 hours a week for years in well over $100,000 in various treatments, has come back at me hard. With the clear awareness, because I've pushed a few of my therapists, come on, you can do a little better than this. This isn't working. You understand? I've paid you 50 grand, and we're doing the same thing. Like, how many times are we going to clear the meridian in Governing in Central about my mother's inadequacy? 50 times? 1,000 times? And when are we going to deal with the fact that it's not working? Meaning, I'm not saying we're not clearing Governing in Central, but I'm saying this isn't working. It's not having the effect. And I'm no clearer, having cleared Governing in Central for the 1,000th time, than I was at the beginning. And so maybe you don't know what you're doing. And a good healer will, and this is why I stuck with Steve for as long as I did. A good healer will say, it's pretty frustrating and stuck. This is what I know how to do. I empathize with your anger and hostility about this. I empathize with your frustration. What my teachings say is, come and do this. And that was better than a defensive therapist that says, you come on, you got to charge. A defensive therapist wants you to pay them to be dysfunctional and to talk about the dysfunction. You try and deal with a therapist's dysfunction, and they immediately want to transfer it to you. And so they say, well, why don't you schedule a session, and you can pay me $170 an hour, and I'll listen empathically to what I'm doing wrong, in the clear understanding that it's not about me, it's about you. And I will do my job to let you process the immature feelings that you have when I'm just doing my job and helping. And is that better or worse than It's like, what does one do? And here we have the helplessness. And it's very difficult to forgive oneself when one doesn't understand and finds oneself in helpless pain that is chronic, particularly in a culture where helpless pain is unwelcome. Because it would be one thing if I say, I've done $100,000 work and I find myself in helpless pain, and everyone said, wow, well, let us love you and massage you and care for you in helpless pain. But when the response is, well, why don't you sort that out on your own? And when you stop feeling helpless pain by some miraculous means, you're welcome back in the group, because we don't really want to deal with your helpless pain. We are a positive group who believes in unconditional love. And so it doesn't seem like you're being very unconditionally loving. So maybe this group isn't for you. Maybe we could exclude you for telling the truth. And this is, of course, maddening. I think Sacred Connections rejected my application because I said I don't believe in unconditional love. Because unconditional love means that you love Donald Trump as much as you love your preferred, hero or whatever it is. And unconditional love means that you love me as much as yourself and this and that, because that's big condition. If it has to be a certain person for you to love them, it just doesn't add up. I don't want to pretend that love within a very conditional framework is in fact love within an unconditional framework, because that's crazy. And the one thing I've got is my sanity. You see, the one thing, one might have all kinds of fear and bitterness and pain, etc. But as long as one tells the truth about every feeling one has, one's tethered to some extent to reality. And in a variety of sugarcoating and various paradigms in parenting, etc., the condition of being part of the group is that you lie, that you pretend that your partner having multiple affairs, which brings up your child's insecure attachment disorder, is great, when in fact you need to do work with your child and love them in a way that no one's taught you to love, long before that you can become an adult enough to hold your own pain and love it, and give true freedom to another individual, not to trigger those buttons. And that love rarely happens in our culture, that inner love. And so there's a lot of fudging of the numbers at all levels in our culture to say that we're feeling something we're not. And I didn't want to go that deep into invisibility, where I would be living a conscious lie in order to belong to a group that wanted conscious lies more than it wanted what was there. And what was there is not welcome within this framework of the spiritual critic, where this is good and that's bad, and everyone has their little systems around that. But the bottom line is, if you're in a place that this group cannot love, the question is, do you give that to the group and say, you don't know how to love me? Or do you give it to yourself and say, I'm unlovable? The group always prefers the latter, because it masks their inadequacy as a system. And this is a very painful, terrain in this thing. And I've gone through a fair amount of that, and, in spending time in different communities and being raised in communities, spending time at Findhorn, spending time at several anthroposophically oriented, communities where people were absolutely committed not to dealing with, with the shit of the leader for whatever reason. So there's unlovability, and trauma equals need. Trauma is one of the few things that we truly need another or others to help with. Trauma equals need. And the reason for that is flooding. You may be able to navigate because you've got eyes and track my fingers going here, but try and navigate in this state and see what's going on. How are you going to, in this state, protect from a slap in the face or a rape, etc. You can't. You have no perspective. And that's what trauma robs us of. It robs us of focus and perspective. When we're out of focus, we're vulnerable. And any person who's in trauma is going in and out in an oversaturated place. And what they desperately need, you see, the camera can't focus right now. It's been flooded with data, and it doesn't know what's going on. And so it doesn't know where to pay attention. And it's getting fuzzy in those fuzzy states when you're driving at 80 miles an hour. Boom, you can die in a second. And this is traumatic. This is terrifying because you grasp you don't have the right perspective. But if you don't have the right perspective because you're faced with an overwhelming trauma, how do you deal with that? I'm going to help the camera by focusing a little bit here. Let's see if it helps it. And we may have fucked up the lens, with that close-up, etc. This is the state of a traumatized human being. Their lens of dealing with reality has lost time and context. You desperately need help because we know how isolated and how vicious our cult can be when we go out of focus and crash and everyone walks away because it's not my problem. This is the sociopathic ethic that we have bred in the chauvinism of the individual. We fail to see the connection between systematically molesting a child in childhood, handing them over to sociopathic teachers that make a passionate choice to avoid all emotional literacy, all trauma literacy, all psychological literacy, and then dump this person out into the professional world in a somewhat dissociated and wounded place, and then tell them to behave cool. You're induced into high pain, but be cool, meaning don't feel anything, and function as if you don't have any of the stuff you actually have. And then say everything's fine, and then you'll do well in this firm. So trauma has need. When the need isn't responded to, when I ask the high facilitators, please listen to me and please hold me, and they have a secret meeting to discuss how they will contain the information, but no one comes over, there's a betrayal of that need. I'm in a flooded place. I nearly got into a traffic accident and I realize I need help and I don't know what I'm doing. I need help from someone who knows what they're doing. So I turn to the people who say they're committed to a world where everyone wins, who trained and recommended my abuser, Peter Sandhill. I turn to them. Please help me.
This has been healthy
But
learning process. Refill for peace with hypnosis, meditation, relaxation, and affirmations, the sleep learning system. It was written and narrated by Joel Tilton.
There's a betrayal of the need for help and the betrayal of the understanding of the state. And this isn't personal, it's cultural, but it affects me personally. It decimates my sense of freedom when I understand that my request for help leads to being feared more than being cared for and understood. And where there's no more direct way than you can say, please hold me so I calm down, so that my physiology doesn't explode, and please listen to me so that you can attune and understand. When that is violated, what does a regressed person who's been abused by a therapist do? It's not intelligent to turn to another therapist after this amount of incompetence. It's not intelligent to turn to one's parents after this amount of denial and incompetence. It's not intelligent to turn to a sociopathic lover who doesn't know how to deal with this terrain in herself or in you. And this is the track record of more than 30 lovers within the high community. a number of who were induced into trauma in the relationship, most of whom induced me into trauma, and none of them had the vocabulary or the terrain mapping skills to say, oh, you're in trauma and you're putting me in trauma, and here's what we need to do about it, and here's how I'll help you, and here's how you help me, and here's a competent person who knows this terrain, and here's a book. Aha. Well, then you can turn to a lover if you have that track record of someone who did that for you. You turn to them and say, look, whatever you were saying, to help me, I'm in trauma. But I never met that person. And so betrayal equals hopelessness. Hopelessness and enormous trauma and helplessness and a sense of betrayal equals enormous amounts of pain beyond my ability to deal with. And so I tell the facilitators, I leave them a recording and I say to all facilitators, I'm in 500% more pain than I've ever dealt with for the entirety of my adult life. Your protocol of excluding me and denying that this is a high issue is not working. Well, what do when every single one of them ignores the recording? It's as if it didn't happen. The message couldn't be louder. We don't want to acknowledge the data because we don't want to acknowledge our incompetence, because we don't know what to do about it. We don't know how to deal with this any more than you do, but you are now a threat for presenting data that reveals the anomalies. This led to a lot of self-harm because it was too terrifying, like the child, to express the aggression towards the parent, because the parent always wins. Some of us are familiar with parental abuse systems, and where first the parent abuses us, then we push back, and they escalate the abuse to emphasize that not only are they not going to change and attune, but they will punish any communication of healthy boundaries, which confuses and switches the internal protector to one of enabling the abuse rather than fighting the abuse. Because as a child, if your protector nearly gets you killed because you're with a sociopath who can't hear no and who doesn't know what they're doing, so the more you say no, the more you bring them to their own state of helplessness, which they don't know how to deal with, and they punish you for making them feel helpless, for revealing their incompetence. If you're in that state, where do you go? One of the things that I started doing was colluding with my abusers to varying degrees so that they would feel safe. In other words, this is where the unhealthy codependency in our culture begins, when the child realizes that they will not get their own needs met by healthy boundaries or anything like that, that the only way to get their healthy needs met is to pamper the abuser into some semblance of reasonable safety or mitigated abuse, where the best way to survive is to obsess about the needs of your abuser, because maybe if they feel better, they'll stop being such jerks. Because as a sensitive, one can be wiped out by the emotional flooding of the parent's terror and fear. You don't want that thrown at you. One can be wiped out by the shame. And one can be knocked into PTSD with sustained physical violence. Now, it would be one thing if our government had a census sent out to children every week or every month and said, have you been hit? Have you been shouted at? Do you feel safe, etc.? Are you feeling lonely? Are you feeling ashamed? And all you do is click yes, and a nice, healthy person shows up at the household a few hours later and says, we like healthy individuals in our culture. They are better for the economy. They're better for the culture. We love our people. And so we're not going to focus on wrong and right and punishing people. What we're going to focus on is healing this family system. And we've got to heal the parent. There's nothing wrong with this child. So we've got to then deal with the abuse that came in your parent. And then that leads back to the government, because who was it who dumped who dumped a grandfather with PTSD and a tank shell in his knee out of World War II? My government. And who was it that wanted to save money by suppressing information about PTSD and pretending it didn't happen to save the military budget for more bombs as opposed to healing the veterans' PTSD? My government. Does it want to look at its cowardice? No. It wants to get elected by whitewashing. And that's what we do in an incompetent culture. So the multi-generational abuse leads back to a grandfather with PTSD, which leads back to a culture that knows how to induce its young men into states of trauma and war and then dump them back on 5-year-old kids back home who are hit and traumatized, like my father, into states of incompetence, and then told, go out and have more kids. We don't protect the child in this country. We protect the government. We protect the power structure. We protect the status quo. So we don't want to look at the data. So we're not going to send out a survey, even when they're free. It doesn't cost a penny to have an online app that tracks the abuses of Americans all around the country. It would be so cheap to get to the truth and start responding. But we're afraid of the truth because we're a shadow-averse cult who believes that it is impossible to deal with the changes needed, etc. And so the easiest thing is to just pretend that they're no big deal, to minimize, defend, etc., etc. It would be the easiest thing in the world for High to send out a census. How many of you have been raped at High? How many people have developed PTSD symptoms at High? How many people know what trauma is? How many people have felt inappropriate sexual energy from a facilitator? How many people got better from which facilitators, and how many people got worse in which areas? This would give a nice data set that would inform anyone actively involved with High in the risks and the blind spots, and we could begin having a dialogue. It would take pennies to put that up. But in a shame cult, it doesn't happen, because it's not about getting at the truth. The belief is we're not good enough, and so we've got to suppress the data. The belief is there's something fundamentally bad going on here, so we don't want to see it, because if we saw it, we couldn't respond. And we don't want to be faced with the unknown. We don't want to be faced with that thing, so we're gonna fear information rather than fearing ignorance, which gets even more confusing when you have a mission statement committed to everyone winning, because no one can win in a paradigm of ignorance, shame, and fear. And that poll of 100 questions, maybe 150 questions, can go out to tens of thousands of current and past High clients within a week. And we can get a small microcosm of some of the issues that the paradigms within the Human Awareness Institute are dealing with, and those are a microcosm of the paradigm and cultural challenges that the country is dealing with, that most parents and children are dealing with to one degree or another. Different degrees, different coping strategies, different blind spots, but this is a cultural challenge. Now, around this time of betrayal, etc., I knew that I needed holding and secure connection, secure attachment, something that I had in no way in the United States. I could not form a secure attachment in the United States, so I went abroad. And the first woman I tried to form an attachment with banned from entering the United States because she's poor. And also, her suicidal mother got into quite a state at the thought of her leaving the country, because the mother was leaning on the child as opposed to, in a healthy relationship, the child being able to leave on the mother. So the mother's sabotaging, which in Asian families, the parents have more influence than in the United States and are expected to. And so, the woman said, that she didn't want to abandon her mother, who might kill herself. if this. So the combination of having her banned from visiting me, her mother's undermining and her loyalty to the mother, that's not a secure attachment. So that fell apart. And then with my wife right now, a very secure relationship, also an abusive family dynamic, but she had been abused enough that she had broken the taboo in Asian cultures of putting family first. So she was putting her health first, which meant that she was choosing me over her family system, which is a traumatic event for any Asian child because of the whole cultural programming there. Now, her relatives also decided to try and sabotage the relationship to some extent, but the biggest sabotage came from my own government. Because she was poor, meaning 95% of all Filipinos are poor by U.S. visa standards, so you just cannot get a visa. You can't write a bond. There's nothing you can do about it. And so I spent $200,000 to spend time overseas and shut down my business so that the relationship wouldn't splinter, which needed nurturing in its infancy. Now I'm spending $200,000 right at the time where my own ability to work and make money is down by 90% because of the PTSD symptoms. And so on the one hand, my income is collapsing without support in honor of the facilitator protocols for denying that this is a high issue. And my government is taking the one woman who can support me in my house and saying, no, we're not going to let you visit her. And this is the, so we're down into helplessness. How do you fight a government who is behaving sociopathically? And when I say sociopathically, what I mean is it's absolutely insane. It's absolutely insane because I'm laying off U.S. workers and costing the economy $200,000 to stop one of the most wonderful women I've ever met from blessing this country with her presence and giving me one secure attachment to help heal the trauma which requires support. Now, it is, of course, fucked up that I should be leaning on my wife because I can't lean on my therapist. And that also brings up the feeling of unlovability. I don't want to be someone leaning on someone else. I want to be someone, being my best self. I can love my best self. But because no one else can love my worst self, I've gotten the message that they're unlovable. But this woman can love my worst self, which is encouraging because I knew I was at the lowest point in my range of disintegration and integration. And so if someone can love and be healthy and benefit and grow with me at my worst, then they're going to have a great surprise when they learn and co-create me being at my best. And this is the crisis of self-love also because I'm at my worst in so many places, and I know it. And no one's been able to love me at my worst, and it's very hard to love myself at my worst. So if I can't love myself in the place I've been induced into, I cannot love and accept the people who induced me into this place, or accept that they're part of a global organization teaching love. That is too crazy. So if I cannot accept myself, I cannot accept them. If I cannot accept them, I'm now in isolation because they are the gatekeepers to my primary source of love and belonging in the community in the United States. So now we're in shame and isolation. The regressed child always interprets isolation as I'm bad and I'm lovable and that's why no one's loving me. How can one learn to love that child when one is terrified that that child is undermining the frameworks of survival by acting up and in this way, in the same way that got me expelled from school, etc. And so it's a very, very, very terrifying environment. And when I explained to the U.S. immigration that I had PTSD and this was my one secure attachment, their response was to become more impersonal. They got afraid of a lawsuit, one. Two, they stopped giving anyone's name, and they're totally protected. It's a very insular sociopathic structure where we will control your life, but you will not even get our names. That's a culture of fear and abuse. It's a government of fear and abuse. It's not, we're trying to help you stay alive, run your business, grow the economy. No, we're trying to damage you in as much way as possible, and we're afraid of you. We're not afraid of the fucked up immigration policy that says that if you don't have more than $30,000 a year in salary, you're not welcome as in any way into the United States. And of course, with PTSD, I couldn't manage the more than 40 pages of fine print per document to fill out the immigration for a fiancé visa, which is the only way you can get someone into the country. Now that takes a year. And during that whole year process, it's uncertain, it's incredibly sociopathic. You know, show up at this point at 7:45 a.m. for a 5-minute meeting, and then that's it. If you miss it, the whole process starts again. It doesn't get more sociopathic. So this in turn creates fear, creates terror, creates loneliness because I'm not being seen and respected. My own tax money is being used to hurt me and hurt my wife. This is enraging, but then we're in a cult that shames rage. So now I'm unlovable again by cult definitions. How do I love myself when no one else can? This is a crisis, and it just keeps coming in wave after wave. And with helplessness and betrayal, with pain and trauma without repair comes hatred, which engages my spiritual critic, because all the spiritual communities that I've dealt with cannot love this part of me or themselves. It's a spirituality of dissociation. It's not a spirituality of understanding the math of the human heart and validating it. So, in this process, my father dies. And I know, psychologically, the spiritual critic in me knows that this is a big deal. I know that I cannot even trust myself with myself, let alone to do something good with my father's death. I also know that he punishes people in direct relationship to proximity. So if I get close to him, he's going to punish me, and I can't deal with more pain right now. I feel overwhelmed again. I want to be someone that can have a good death with his dad. I can't even have a good life with myself, let alone a good death with my fat dad. So I resent him, I resent Hai, and I feel inadequate. I didn't want my father to die when I'm in the worst pain, but he did. Well, since when did he consult me on when he's planning to do difficult things for me to deal with? He has always done what he wanted to do in his own way. And then there was the pain and trauma of my siblings. And around this time, I met a stranger in a cafe who told me what trauma was, and that's what's bringing this data to you here is the books that I read, The Body Keeps the Score, etc. So finally I learned, aha, this is what's going on. It's not a child's fault that they were traumatized. This is what needs to be happening, and it's not happening. So it helped with the understanding piece, which was a big part of self-forgiveness. The spiritual critic did not, because the pain levels were so high that I was just filled with constant addictive blame, pain, rage, hate, self-punishment, and overeating to manage the overwhelming pain I couldn't feel. And and understanding that the more I entered this state, the more no one in my cult knew how to love and care for this part of me, which meant I was on my own, which meant I'm carrying the culture shame again, that I'm unlovable because this cult knows how to produce these states in me but doesn't know how to name them or respond to them effectively. And it's very difficult for me in trauma to learn about trauma and have empathy for myself when I'm abusing my wife to some extent, because everyone who is in PTSD abuses everyone around them to some extent. My father wasn't singled out for my grandfather's abuse when he came home with PTSD. Everyone is going to be abused with an emotionally shut down, terrified, and violent person. My spiritual critic tracks every one of my transgressions minutely and knows that I can't do anything about it because it's a pain management process. It's like pressure cooking release, and I'm already at explosive point. How do I love this part, which now starts to look a lot like my abusers? How do I blame my abusers and transfer that energy out there when I'm becoming my abuser? Where do I go? It's just round and round in pain and blame, self-punishment, other punishment, and in a reality where no one, including me, knows how to love this part of me. Well, in childhood, I leaned hard on my rational brain, and that's what I leaned hard on here. I started a nonprofit. I started a trauma blog. I helped my wife enormously. I helped other people in ways that I could. I sent money to Julian Assange, who was being traumatized for telling the truth to the U.S. government. I sent money to Edward Snowden, who was, again, being traumatized for telling the truth in their government. Truth tellers are the enemy in an incompetent culture that is shame-based. But truth tellers are the voice of healing, the voice of beginning. You cannot solve a problem you refuse to see. If you refuse to see it, it's based on a belief that you can't solve it. You can't solve something you don't believe you can solve. But you can't challenge the belief until you see the data clearly. Now, one of the big frustrations in all of this is that I knew how High could have solved this entire thing from happening with 10 minutes of competence. But they refused at each step of the way. And this is the problem with a state of consciousness that can create problems but can't deal with them. It takes far more energy and effort to create and deal with a crisis of this nature than to preclude it or solve it. And that's one of the gifts that I give back to any power structure that's listening here. It takes far less energy to preclude and or heal a trauma than it does to deny it and mask around it. But the facilitators didn't demonstrate those 5 to 10 minutes of competency. And just to give you a little window into that, one person, one strong person has to say this: your safety and well-being is my number one concern. I'm not going to leave you in this state. You will get out of it, and I will see that you do, whatever it takes. Now, what do you need? How can I help? I have had that answer on the tip of my tongue from the first time I asked. Please listen, please hold. That's what I needed. And that is exactly what was denied. So rather than going away, it escalates from trauma into PTSD. As I'm then given an abuse contract that says, please promise never to tell anyone what happened and never to sue High. And by the way, this is not a High issue. That is the exact opposite of what's needed. Now, when that's coming from your leaders, your teachers of love and healthy relationship, that is a traumatic realization. Because if your leaders are that fucked up, how can one expect one in a state of trauma to do better? That is a very uncertain expectation. And how can one expect them to do better when the better begins with truth-telling, and truth-telling is the enemy of the system of which they meet primary needs for love and belonging? When you will be banished and traumatized again for telling the truth, how do you deal with that? I didn't know how. The only thing that I could settle on was I will make sure that the next person doesn't get treated this way. I don't know how to solve this on my own. So when there's a lack of knowing, there's a lack of empowerment, which means you can't medicate your own helplessness and grief. You're stuck in this tailspin. With my spiritual critic reminding me at every day that I should be more positive, that, you know, this and that and the other, which just left me feeling more unlovable because I wasn't feeling that way. I was also getting in touch with my siblings at this time, who, first of all betrayed me in this state, but secondly, all revealed long-term symptoms of chronic trauma from my parental abuse. So it got clearer and clearer in my mind that these kinds of traumas hurt people for a lifetime unless they get sorted out, which meant it's important that this gets sorted out. But I wrote to everyone in the high community, and no one advocated for a change, either at the board level, the team level, the facilitator, or the community level. No one said, we've got a fucked up power system, let's look at how to heal the system. Everyone said, go away. There were a few that personally attacked me, which meant it's not safe to ask for help within the room of love. Well, if it isn't safe to ask in the room of love, where is it safe to ask that we make changes that are necessary for the safety and sanity of our fellow human beings? I don't have the answer to that, which brings up a sense of uncertainty, which is terrifying if you're in trauma and terror. You want certainty. And so you look for strong, competent, ethical leadership to assuage the terror. But it was falling right and left. Another therapist decided to attack me when I complained to them for, not standing up for me at this stage. My buddy Steve, who I told you about earlier, he said, these people sound like they're nuts. I don't want anything to do with them. I'd love to keep charging you money and have you come and talk about what they're doing to you, and I'd love to support you there. But I'm not going to advocate for the other people in the community. I'm not going to get involved. I'm not going to, in any way, be the adult so that you can fall apart in your grief here, because I'm scared of them. So when your healer is scared of your abuser more than you are, what is that saying about your ability to fare well in that? And what a fucked up healer, and so then I decided I'm through. You didn't recognize a single traumatic symptom. You've never dealt with the fact that all of this stuff has not been getting results. You want to just keep charging indefinitely, and you won't stand up for a sexual abuse survivor in crisis because you're scared of getting involved. Well, so were all the parents who saw traumatic abuse systems in my family and were goody two-shoes Waldorf parents, but didn't want to face my parents. I don't need another child who is afraid of advocating for abuse survivors. I need an adult, and I'm not finding it in the therapeutic community, and I'm not finding it inside. I've never learned what adult is. And parts of me haven't grown up because they've been repressed in trauma. So I can't count on anything. And I feel hurt and lonely and betrayed, and there's nowhere for that to go. Because the spiritual critic says I should be forgiving and blah, 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 blah. So this is just a very, very big wound.